The radio crackled to life at 7:42 in the evening, on November 5, 1975. The voice on the other end was breathless, frantic, barely coherent. 6 men were talking over each other, their words tumbling out in a cascade of panic that made the dispatcher lean forward in her chair, straining to understand what they were saying. Someone was missing. Someone had been hit by something. No, not hit. Taken. The men kept using that word, taken. And in their voices was a terror, so raw and primal, that it sent ice through the veins of everyone who would later hear that recording. They had come straight from the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest. Those 6 loggers, their truck tearing down the mountain roads faster than was safe, faster than was sane. Their hands were shaking. Some of them were crying. Grown men, hard men who spent their days in the wilderness cutting timber, reduced to this state of animal fear. They stumbled into the Navajo County Sheriff's Office in Holbrook, Arizona, with a story that seemed ripped from the pages of science fiction. Yet the sheer authenticity of their terror suggested something far more disturbing than fantasy. Their co-worker, Travis Walton, was gone. 22 years old, an ordinary woodcutter with calloused hands and a reputation for reliability. He had been with them just hours before, finishing up their work in the failing November light. They were heading home, their truck bouncing along the Forest Service road, when they saw it through the trees. A light. Aye, not the warm orange of a campfire or the yellow beam of a flashlight. This was different. Brilliant, almost painful to look at, hovering just above the ground in a clearing ahead. Travis had jumped out of the truck. Against the screams of his crew, against all common sense, he had moved toward it. And that was when it happened. A beam of light, they said, struck him like a bolt of lightning. His body lifted off the ground, flung backward through the air like a rag doll. The men in the truck panicked, screaming at their driver to go, to get out of there, and he did. They fled, leaving Travis behind in that dark forest, beneath something they could not explain and did not understand. When they returned minutes later, shame overcoming fear, Travis was gone. The light was gone. Only the silent pines remained, witnesses to whatever impossible thing had just occurred. The sheriff listened to their story with the kind of skepticism you would expect. 6 men show up claiming a UFO took their friend, and the immediate thought, the logical thought, is murder. A falling out among workers. An accident covered up with an outlandish story. The interrogations began almost immediately. The men were separated, their stories compared for inconsistencies. Law enforcement combed the forest with search dogs and helicopters, looking not for a victim of alien abduction, but for a body, evidence of foul play, signs of violence. But the polygraph tests complicated everything. 5 of the 6 men passed. The machines measuring their physiological responses suggested they believed what they were saying. They truly thought they had witnessed something beyond explanation. The 6th test was inconclusive, not a failure but not a confirmation either. How do you reconcile that with the theory of murder? How do you explain 6 men maintaining the same impossible story under intense pressure and scrutiny? For 5 days, Travis Walton was gone. His family held on to hope that twisted into agony with each passing hour. The media descended on the small Arizona community, turning a local missing person case into a national spectacle. Skeptics and believers alike debated what had really happened in those woods. And then, on November 10, 1975, a phone call came. Travis was alive. He was confused, dehydrated, huddled in a phone booth on the outskirts of Heber, a small town near the forest where he had disappeared. When they found him, he was not the same. Something in his eyes had changed, a haunted quality that those who knew him said had not been there before. He remembered the beam of light. He remembered pain. And then he remembered waking in a place that defied everything he understood about reality. A room with walls that seemed to glow from within. Beings standing over him, with large eyes and pale skin, watching him with an expression he could not read. Was it curiosity? Clinical detachment? He could not say. The story Travis told in the days and weeks that followed would become one of the most scrutinized alien abduction accounts in history. He described medical examinations, strange instruments, a terror so complete it shut down rational thought. He described trying to fight, to escape, and the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that came with being in the presence of something utterly beyond human control. His account included details that seemed to corroborate similar stories told by others around the world, people who had never met Travis Walton, who had no reason to align their stories with his. Government investigators arrived. The case file grew thick with interviews, polygraph results, and reports that tried to make sense of the senseless. Some officials dismissed it entirely. Others were not so sure. The consistency of the witnesses, the physical and psychological state of Travis upon his return, the lack of any evidence pointing to a conventional explanation. These things lingered, uncomfortable questions without satisfying answers. What happens to a human mind when it encounters something so far outside the boundaries of normal experience that it has no framework to process it? Psychologists who examined Travis found signs of genuine trauma, the kind that does not come from fabrication but from lived experience. Whether that experience was what he claimed, or something else entirely remained the subject of fierce debate. But the trauma was real. The fear was real. Something had happened in those woods that November night, something that left 6 men terrified, and 1 man missing for 5 days. And at the heart of it all remains that haunting question, the one that keeps people awake at night, the one that transforms a story from mere curiosity into something that touches the deepest human fears about our place in the universe. What happens to a human mind and body when taken aboard something not of this world? Do we return the same, or does the experience break something fundamental inside us, shattering our understanding of reality itself? Travis Walton came back, but in the eyes of those who know the case best, a part of him never left that clearing in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest, forever trapped in those 5 missing days that changed everything. The crew had been working since dawn that Wednesday, November 5, 1975, high in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest, outside of Snowflake, Arizona. Mike Rogers led a team of 7 men, including himself, through the grueling work of thinning timber under a Forest Service contract. They were behind schedule, and Rogers pushed them hard. The autumn sun was already sinking behind the ponderosa pines when they finally loaded their gear into the single truck, exhausted and ready for home. In the bed of the pickup rode Alan Dallas, Dwayne Smith, and John Goulet. Kenneth Peterson sat up front with Mike Rogers, who drove, while Steve Pierce and Travis Walton squeezed in beside them. They were covered in sawdust and pine sap, their muscles aching from chainsaw work that had lasted nearly 12 hours. The temperature was dropping fast, as it always did in the high country when the sun went down, and they were eager to get back to town. Mike Rogers steered the truck along the winding dirt road that cut through Turkey Springs, the truck's headlights beginning to sweep through the gathering dusk. The forest on either side stood thick and dark, the kind of darkness that only comes to wilderness areas far from any town lights. They were tired, mostly quiet, the kind of exhausted silence that settles over men after a long day of physical labor. Some of them would later remember joking about getting home, about what they'd have for dinner, the ordinary concerns of working men at the end of an ordinary day. Then they came around a bend near a small clearing, and everything changed. Dwayne Smith saw it first from the truck bed. He would later describe it as a glow through the trees, something that didn't belong, something that made his stomach drop even before his mind could process what he was seeing. He called out, and Mike Rogers hit the brakes. The truck rolled to a stop, and every man in it stared at what hovered above the clearing just 30 yards away. The craft was roughly 15 feet in diameter, they would later estimate, though estimating size when your reference points have vanished becomes nearly impossible. It hung motionless about 20 feet above the ground, completely silent, emitting a yellowish-white glow that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The shape was disc-like, though witnesses would struggle to describe it precisely. Some would say it looked like 2 pie plates pressed together. Others mentioned a domed top. What they all agreed on was the light, that strange, almost living quality to the illumination it cast across the clearing. Travis Walton, sitting in the cramped cab, pushed open the passenger door before anyone could stop him. He climbed down from the truck with what his crewmates would describe as fascination, not fear. Mike Rogers shouted at him to get back in the truck, but Travis was already walking toward the clearing, toward the hovering object, drawn forward in a way that none of them could later fully explain. The other men began yelling now, all of them, their voices rising in panic and warning. Travis reached the edge of the clearing and moved beneath the craft, looking up at it. He would later have no memory of what drove him forward, what compelled him to approach something so obviously otherworldly and potentially dangerous. The crew watched him stop directly under the glowing disc, watched him stare upward. Then the craft began to make a sound, a high-pitched whirring that built in intensity. It wobbled slightly, tilting toward Travis. That's when Alan Dallas and the others in the truck bed started hammering on the roof of the cab, screaming at Mike to get out of there, to leave, to drive. But Mike Rogers sat frozen, his hands still on the wheel, watching his friend standing in that clearing. The beam came suddenly, a brilliant blue-green column of light that shot downward from the underside of the craft and struck Travis Walton full in the chest. Multiple witnesses would later describe how Travis was lifted roughly a foot off the ground, his arms flung outward, his body rigid. The light seemed solid somehow, substantial, like a physical thing connecting the craft to the man. Travis was thrown backward with violent force, collapsing to the ground in a heap. That broke the spell. Mike Rogers slammed the truck into gear and gunned the engine, tearing away down the dirt road with several men still in the open bed. They fled in absolute terror, the truck fishtailing on the loose gravel, branches whipping at the sides of the vehicle, as Rogers drove faster than was remotely safe on that winding forest road. He drove for nearly a quarter mile before some measure of reason returned, before guilt and shame began to override panic. Mike Rogers slowed the truck and stopped. The men looked at each other, breathing hard, some of them shaking. They had just left Travis Walton lying in that clearing, possibly dead, certainly injured, and they had run like frightened animals. Kenneth Peterson would later say that the fear was like nothing he'd experienced before or since, a primal terror that overrode every other instinct. But now they were away from it, and Travis was still back there. They argued, voices rising and overlapping. Some wanted to keep driving, to get to town and bring back help, police, anyone. Others insisted they had to go back, had to check on Travis. Mike Rogers, his hands still trembling on the steering wheel, turned the truck around. The drive back took an eternity, though it was less than a minute. Every man in that truck was certain they would find Travis dead in the clearing, or worse, that the craft would still be there, waiting for them. Mike Rogers slowed as they approached the spot, and they could see the clearing through the trees. It was empty. The craft was gone. And so was Travis Walton. There was no body, no sign of the beam of light, no evidence that anything had happened except for the disturbed pine needles where Travis had fallen. They stopped the truck and several men climbed out, calling Travis's name into the darkness. Their voices echoed through the forest and came back unanswered. They searched the immediate area, shining flashlights into the trees, looking for any sign of their missing crewmate. They found nothing. The forest had swallowed Travis Walton as completely as if he had never existed. Mike Rogers made the decision to drive into town and report what had happened. As they approached Heber, the nearest town with a sheriff's office, the full weight of what they were about to claim began to settle over them. They were going to walk into a police station and report that their co-worker had been struck by a beam of light from a flying saucer and had vanished. The absurdity and terror of it mixed into something like nausea. They arrived at the sheriff's office just after 7:30 in the evening. Deputy Sheriff Chuck Ellison was the first officer to hear their story, and he would later describe the men as genuinely terrified, some of them close to hysteria. But their story was so outlandish, so completely outside the realm of normal experience, that skepticism was immediate and intense. Here the accounts began to diverge in small but significant ways. Under separate questioning, the details of who saw what and when started to show inconsistencies. Some remembered the craft tilting before the beam struck Travis. Others were certain it remained level. The color of the light was described as blue-green by most, but one witness said it was more white. The duration of the beam varied in their tellings from a few seconds to nearly half a minute. These were exactly the kinds of discrepancies that investigators look for, the signs that witnesses are fabricating or coordinating a false story. Navajo County Sheriff Marlin Gillespie took personal charge of the investigation, and he was deeply suspicious from the beginning. The story was too fantastic, too convenient. His immediate theory was that something had happened to Travis Walton, something violent, and that these 6 men had concocted an elaborate story to cover it up. The fact that Mike Rogers had a contract with the Forest Service that he was behind on, A contract that would be voided if he couldn't complete it suggested a possible motive. Perhaps Travis had wanted to quit, or threatened to report substandard work, and the confrontation had turned deadly. The interrogations intensified. Each man was questioned separately, their statements recorded and compared. Investigators looked for cracks in their stories, contradictions that would reveal the truth. They asked the same questions multiple ways, tried to catch the witnesses in lies. But while the small details varied, the core account remained consistent. Every man described the glowing craft, Travis approaching it, the beam of light, and the panicked flight. The emotional reactions were consistent too. These men were terrified, and experienced investigators know that genuine terror is nearly impossible to fake convincingly, especially across 6 separate individuals. Sheriff Gillespie brought in polygraph examiner Cy Gilson from the Arizona Department of Public Safety to administer lie detector tests. 5 of the 6 men agreed immediately. Mike Rogers initially refused, saying he was too emotionally overwrought, but he later took the test as well. The results were striking. 5 of the 6 passed without significant deception indicated. Only Alan Dallas showed some irregular responses, though not enough to conclusively indicate lying. Despite this, the sheriff remained unconvinced. He authorized a massive search operation that began the very next morning. Deputy sheriffs, Forest Service personnel, and civilian volunteers combed through the area where Travis had vanished. They brought in tracking dogs, hoping the animals could pick up a scent trail. The dogs showed interest in the clearing where the crew said Travis had been struck, circling and whining, but they couldn't establish a direction of travel from that point. It was as if Travis's scent simply ended in that spot. The search expanded to cover miles of dense forest. Searchers looked for any sign of a body, evidence of a struggle, disturbed earth that might indicate a hasty grave. They found nothing. The November cold was settling in hard now, and if Travis Walton was alive somewhere in that forest, hypothermia would kill him within days if he was injured or disoriented. Local media picked up the story, and what had been a local incident rapidly became national news. The idea that a man had been abducted by a UFO from the Arizona wilderness captured public imagination in a way that few stories did. This was just 2 years after the Pascagoula incident, during a period when UFO sightings were reported regularly across the country. The Walton case had everything: multiple witnesses, a dramatic abduction, and a genuine mystery. As the search entered its 3rd day, then its 4th, the focus began to shift. The prevailing theory among investigators became that Travis was dead, that his body was hidden somewhere in the vast forest, and that the remaining crew members knew more than they were telling. The men were subjected to additional questioning, more polygraphs, and increasing public suspicion. Some locals in Snowflake began to view them as murderers, regardless of what the lie detector tests indicated. Travis's mother, Mary Kellett, maintained absolute faith that her son was alive and would return. She gave interviews saying she believed the crew's account, that Travis had been taken by something not of this world, and that he would come back. Her certainty seemed almost supernatural to some observers, a mother's intuition operating on a level beyond evidence or logic. The 5th day of the search came and went. More than 50 people had combed through hundreds of acres of forest. They had found no body, no evidence, no answer. The temperature dropped below freezing at night now. If Travis Walton was lost in the woods, he was almost certainly dead. The search operation began to wind down, though it would continue at reduced levels for several more days. Sheriff Gillespie remained convinced that this was a homicide, that Travis Walton had died the night of November 5th, and that 6 men knew exactly what had happened to him. But deep in the forest, something else was happening. Something that would transform this case from a suspected murder into one of the most documented and investigated alien abduction claims in history. On the morning of November 15th, 1975, just days after Travis Walton reappeared in Heber, Arizona, a man named Cy Gilson knocked on the door of a small house where the logging crew had gathered. Gilson was a polygraph examiner for the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and he carried with him a machine that law enforcement believed could measure the difference between truth and deception. The crew members had volunteered for this test, understanding that their lives and reputations now hinged on the readings of sensors attached to their bodies, tracking their sweat, their breathing, their heartbeats, as they answered questions about what happened in the woods. Mike Rogers went first. He sat in a straight-back chair, while Gilson wrapped pneumograph tubes around his chest and abdomen to measure his breathing patterns. Metal plates went on 2 fingers to measure galvanic skin response, the electrical conductivity of his skin that changes with perspiration. A blood pressure cuff tightened around his upper arm. These instruments would create inked lines on scrolling paper, a visual representation of his body's involuntary responses as he answered yes or no to carefully constructed questions. Gilson established baseline measurements first, asking control questions he already knew the answers to. Then came the relevant questions. Did you see Travis Walton get struck by a beam of light from a UFO? Did Travis Walton leave the truck before you drove away? Is Travis Walton actually nearby while you claim he is missing? Rogers answered each question, his voice steady, while the polygraph needles traced patterns across the moving paper. When Gilson analyzed the results, he concluded that Rogers showed no deception. His physiological responses indicated he was telling the truth. One by one, the other crew members took the test. Alan Dallas, the youngest at 17 years old, sat in the chair with the sensors attached. His breathing quickened during the examination, his heart rate elevated, but Gilson noted this was consistent with nervousness rather than deception. The pattern of responses that indicates lying, a specific spike at the moment of a false statement, did not appear. Dallas passed. Kenneth Peterson passed. John Goulet passed. Steve Pierce, who had been most reluctant to come forward initially, who had wanted to stay quiet about what they saw, also passed the examination. Dwayne Smith, Mike Rogers' brother-in-law, took the polygraph last. The questions were the same, probing whether the men had actually witnessed what they claimed, whether Travis had been harmed by them, whether this was an elaborate hoax. Smith's responses showed no deception. 5 men out of 6 had been tested, and all 5 had passed. Travis Walton himself could not yet be tested because he had just returned and was in a state of physical and psychological distress that made polygraph examination meaningless. The examiner needed a subject in a relatively calm state for the test to have any validity. The results should have settled the matter, but they raised new questions instead. Sheriff Marlon Gillespie expressed skepticism, not about the polygraph results themselves, but about what they meant. He suggested that if the men genuinely believed they saw something unusual, even if it was not a UFO, they might pass the test. The polygraph measured belief as much as truth. If the crew members had witnessed something they interpreted as otherworldly, even if the actual event was mundane, their conviction could render them truthful in the machine's assessment. This opened a philosophical debate about the nature of polygraph testing itself. The machine does not detect lies directly. It measures stress responses, the body's reaction to the cognitive burden of deception. When a person lies, they must simultaneously suppress the truth and construct a false narrative, a mental effort that typically produces measurable physiological changes. But what if the person believes their own story? What if the memory has been so thoroughly constructed or misinterpreted that the teller experiences no internal conflict? The scientific community in 1975 remained divided on polygraph reliability. The American Psychological Association had published studies showing accuracy rates varying wildly, from 60% to 90%, depending on the examiner's skill and the testing conditions. Some psychologists argued that sociopaths, who feel no anxiety about lying, could easily defeat the test. Others noted that highly anxious, truthful people might fail simply because their baseline stress levels were so elevated. Despite these controversies, law enforcement continued to use polygraphs extensively. Police departments valued them as investigative tools, ways to narrow suspect lists or encourage confession. The threat of a polygraph often prompted guilty parties to admit their deceptions before being tested, but courts remained cautious. Most judges refused to admit polygraph evidence in trials, recognizing that the science was not robust enough to meet standards for admissible evidence. Into this uncertain landscape came the National Enquirer, a tabloid newspaper known for sensational headlines and checkbook journalism. The Enquirer had built a circulation in the millions by covering celebrity scandals, bizarre medical stories, and paranormal claims. The publication employed actual journalists, many with traditional newspaper backgrounds, but operated under different editorial standards than mainstream news organizations. The Inquirer paid for stories, sometimes substantial sums, which critics argued created incentives for fabrication. When the National Enquirer learned about Travis Walton's case, editors saw an opportunity for a blockbuster story. They sent representatives to Arizona and offered to pay for Travis to take a polygraph examination, conducted by an examiner of the newspaper's choosing. For Travis and Mike Rogers, who were facing financial difficulties and mounting skepticism, the offer seemed like a chance to prove their story and receive compensation. They agreed. The Enquirer arranged for John McCarthy, a polygraph examiner in Phoenix, to conduct the test on the night of December 25, 1975, Christmas night. Travis arrived at McCarthy's office, still showing signs of the ordeal he claimed to have endured. He appeared thin, his eyes hollow, his manner agitated. McCarthy attached the polygraph sensors and began the examination process. The test went badly from the start. Travis's physiological responses spiked dramatically on control questions and relevant questions alike. His breathing became irregular. His galvanic skin response showed extreme variations. When McCarthy asked if Travis had actually been on board a spacecraft, the needle patterns indicated deception. When asked if the entire story was a hoax, the responses were inconclusive, confused, impossible to read clearly. McCarthy stopped the examination early. He told the Enquirer representatives that Travis Walton had failed the polygraph test, showing deception on key questions about the UFO encounter. The Enquirer chose not to publish the results. The newspaper had paid for the test, but the outcome did not support the sensational story they wanted to tell. Instead, the Enquirer's editors decided to arrange for additional testing, hoping for different results that would justify their investment. This decision would later fuel criticism that the tabloid was more interested in creating a compelling narrative than uncovering truth. News of the failed test leaked anyway. Skeptics seized on it as proof that the entire Walton case was fabricated. If Travis could not pass a polygraph examination, how could anyone believe his story? Philip Klass, an aviation journalist and prominent UFO skeptic, obtained McCarthy's test results and publicized them widely. Klass argued that the case should be dismissed entirely based on this failed polygraph. Travis and his supporters countered that the test conditions were flawed. Christmas night, less than a month after his return, Travis was still traumatized and exhausted. He had not eaten properly that day. The late-night timing, the pressure from the Enquirer representatives watching, the stakes of the examination, all contributed to an emotional state that made accurate polygraph testing impossible. Any examiner should have recognized that the subject was too distressed for valid testing, they argued. The debate intensified when several months later Travis took another polygraph examination under different circumstances. This time, the examiner was George Pfeiffer, a respected polygrapher in Phoenix with years of experience in law enforcement and private practice. Pfeiffer had a reputation for thorough, careful work and had testified in numerous court proceedings about polygraph methodology. Pfeiffer conducted the examination in February of 1976. Travis arrived in better physical condition, having had time to recover and process his experience. The testing environment was professional and calm. Pfeiffer asked a series of carefully worded questions about the core claims of Travis's story. Did you see a UFO on November 5th? Were you taken aboard a craft? Did you make up this story? Travis answered each question while the polygraph recorded his responses. When Pfeiffer analyzed the charts, he concluded that Travis Walton was telling the truth. The physiological patterns showed no deception. Travis's body responded with the calm consistency of someone answering honestly, without the stress spikes that accompany lying. Pfeiffer staked his professional reputation on the results, stating that in his expert opinion, Travis believed everything he had described about his abduction experience. This created a paradox. Two different examiners had tested the same person about the same events and reached opposite conclusions. Skeptics pointed to the failed test as definitive. Believers highlighted the past test as vindication. Both sides could claim polygraph evidence for their position, which ultimately demonstrated the fundamental weakness of relying on such testing for establishing objective truth. The scientific debate about polygraph reliability grew more sophisticated in the years following the Walton case. Researchers identified specific techniques that could be used to defeat polygraph tests, such as controlled breathing, muscle tension in the toes or fingers, or mental arithmetic to create confusion in the baseline readings. Some studies suggested that people who thoroughly convinced themselves of their own fabrications could pass polygraph tests because they experienced no internal conflict about their statements. Yet the fact remained that 6 men, not just one, had passed polygraph examinations about the Walton incident. The 5 crew members who witnessed Travis being struck by the light had all been tested in the immediate aftermath, when the incident was fresh and the pressure was intense. The statistical improbability of this coordination became a central argument in favor of the story's authenticity. Consider the mathematics of deception. If polygraph tests are 70% accurate, a conservative estimate, then each person taking the test has a 30% chance of producing a false negative, passing while lying. For 6 independent people to all produce false negatives, you multiply those probabilities. 0.3 times, 0.3 times, 0.3 times, 0.3 times, 0.3 times, 0.3 equals roughly 0.7%, less than 1 chance in 100. And that assumes the men were lying, highly coordinated in their story, and all managed to defeat the polygraph through coincidence or skill. The alternative explanation, that the men were telling the truth as they understood it, seemed more statistically probable even to some skeptics. But this raised the deeper question of perception and memory. Could 6 men genuinely believe they saw something that did not happen in the way they described? Could mass hysteria or misperception create a shared false memory strong enough to pass polygraph scrutiny? The National Enquirer eventually published a story about the Walton case, paying Travis and Mike Rogers for their cooperation. The publication ran photographs and detailed accounts of the alleged abduction. The tabloid's involvement cut both ways for the case's credibility. On one hand, the Enquirer's participation brought the story to millions of readers who might never have heard of a small-town logging crew's strange experience. The newspaper's resources allowed for additional investigation and testing that local authorities could not afford. On the other hand, association with the National Enquirer tainted the case in the eyes of serious researchers and journalists. The tabloid's reputation for sensationalism and paid stories suggested that financial incentives might have influenced the narrative. Critics argued that once money entered the equation, the witnesses had motivation to maintain their story regardless of truth. The polygraph evidence in the Travis Walton case ultimately proved inconclusive in settling the debate, serving instead as a mirror for existing beliefs. Those predisposed to accept the possibility of UFO encounters pointed to the past tests as strong corroboration. Those skeptical of such claims emphasized the failed test and the general unreliability of polygraph science. The machines could not resolve the mystery, only add another layer of complexity to a case that already challenged conventional understanding of truth, perception, and the limits of human knowledge. The sensation returned to Travis Walton slowly, as if his consciousness were dragging itself up from the bottom of a black ocean. Pain came first, a white-hot agony radiating through every nerve in his body. His chest felt compressed, as though an enormous weight pressed down on his rib cage. His throat burned with a dry, metallic taste that coated his tongue. When he finally managed to force his eyes open, the light that flooded his vision was wrong, too bright and too cold, with a bluish quality that seemed to penetrate directly into his brain. He was lying on his back on something hard and smooth. The surface beneath him was neither metal nor plastic, but something that felt organic and artificial at the same time, slightly warm to the touch, but utterly unyielding. As his vision began to clear, Travis became aware that he was not alone. Standing over him were 3 figures, and the sight of them sent a jolt of pure terror through his body so intense that he tried to scream, but his throat only produced a strangled gasp. They were small, barely reaching what he estimated would be 4 feet tall if they had been standing on the ground beside him. But it was not their size that froze his blood. Their skin was gray, the color of cigarette ash, smooth and almost luminescent in the strange light. Their bodies were thin, almost skeletal, with limbs that seemed too delicate to be functional. But it was their heads that commanded his horrified attention. The skulls were bulbous, oversized for their slight frames, and their faces were dominated by enormous black eyes that held no white, no iris, just vast pools of darkness that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Those eyes stared at him without blinking, without any expression he could read. Travis tried to move, to push himself away from these impossible beings, but his limbs responded sluggishly, as though he were moving through thick water. One of the creatures moved closer, extending a hand with 3 long fingers toward his chest. The fingers were tipped with what looked like small dark pads, and Travis could see his own chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his shirt as panic seized his lungs. He managed to turn his head, fighting against the strange lethargy that filled his muscles, and took in his surroundings with mounting horror. The room was small, perhaps 15 feet across, with curved walls that seemed to merge seamlessly into the ceiling. There were no visible corners, no right angles anywhere. The walls themselves glowed with that same cold blue-white light, as if they were made of illuminated material rather than being lit by any external source. The air was cool and had a strange quality to it, slightly humid, and carrying an odor that Travis would later struggle to describe. Some witnesses would report he called it antiseptic, while others remembered him saying it was organic, like the inside of a body. Along one curved wall, he could make out what appeared to be instruments or devices, though their purpose was utterly alien to anything he had encountered. There were no knobs or buttons he could identify, no screens or displays that made any sense. Some of the objects seemed to shift or shimmer as he looked at them, as though they existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. Other instruments appeared more concrete, and these were the ones that terrified him most. They looked vaguely medical, with extensions that could have been probes or needles, surfaces that might have been meant for cutting or holding or scanning. The ambiguity of their function made them all the more horrifying. The gray beings moved around him with fluid, coordinated motions. They did not speak, at least not in any way Travis could hear, but they seemed to communicate nonetheless. Their movements suggested purpose and deliberation. One of them reached toward a tray that Travis had not noticed before, positioned just at the edge of his peripheral vision. On the tray were more instruments, thin and gleaming in the cold light. That was when something deep and primal inside Travis Walton snapped. The paralysis that had held him broke under a surge of adrenaline and pure survival instinct. He lurched upward from the table, swinging his arms wildly at the creatures surrounding him. His hand connected with one of the beings, and the sensation was horrifying in itself. The skin felt cool and smooth, slightly damp, with a texture unlike anything human. The creature stumbled backward, and the others retreated several steps, those enormous black eyes fixed on him with what might have been surprise or alarm, or nothing at all. Human emotions could not be read in those faces. Travis rolled off the table and landed hard on the floor, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. The floor had the same slightly yielding quality as the table, and he struggled to maintain his balance. His body felt wrong, lighter somehow, though his limbs still responded with that underwater slowness. He looked around frantically for an exit and spotted an opening in the curved wall, a darker space that might lead somewhere else, anywhere other than this nightmare room, with its silent watchers and incomprehensible instruments. He ran. His coordination was poor, and he bounced off the curved wall once before finding the opening. The gray beings did not pursue him, but he could feel their eyes on his back as he stumbled through the doorway into a corridor beyond. The hallway curved in both directions, following the same organically smooth architecture as the examination room. The walls here were darker, charcoal gray rather than glowing white, and lit by strips of softer amber light that ran along where the wall met the floor. Travis chose a direction at random and moved as quickly as his unsteady legs would carry him. He passed other openings, other rooms, but he was too terrified to look inside them for more than a glance. In one, he saw what appeared to be rows of containers or tanks, cylindrical shapes filled with cloudy liquid. In another, there were more instruments, larger than those in the examination room, with curved armatures and lens-like structures. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the soft padding of his feet on the strange floor. Then he turned a corner and stopped dead. 3 figures stood before him in the corridor, but these were not the gray beings. These appeared human, or nearly so. They were tall, well over 6 feet, and they wore one-piece suits of a silvery material that seemed to shift between metallic and cloth-like, depending on how the light caught it. Their faces were human in structure, but perfect in a way that was deeply unsettling. Smooth skin, symmetrical features, large eyes that were blue or possibly green. They wore no expressions Travis could read. Their faces held the same neutral blankness as the gray beings, but somehow more disturbing because these faces should have shown emotion and did not. One of them, a male figure, stepped forward and reached toward Travis. The gesture might have been meant as reassurance, but Travis recoiled violently. The figure persisted, moving closer with smooth, unhurried steps. Travis tried to speak, to demand answers or plead for release, but his voice came out in broken fragments. "Where am I? What do you want? Let me go." The human-like beings did not respond with words. Instead, two of them took his arms, their grip gentle but utterly firm. He tried to resist, but his strength was failing, the adrenaline surge draining away and leaving him weak and shaking. They led him, half supporting his weight, through more corridors to a larger room. This space was different from the others, higher ceilinged and more open. The dominant feature was what Travis would later describe as a planetarium, though that word could not truly capture what he experienced. One entire wall, curved like all the others, displayed an image of space. Not a screen or a projection, but what appeared to be a direct view through transparent material into the void beyond. Stars burned with unwavering light, too numerous and too bright. And there, suspended in that impossible blackness, was Earth. Travis had seen photographs of Earth from space, the famous images from the Apollo missions that had saturated news broadcasts and magazine covers. But this was different. This was immediate and real, and close enough that he could make out the swirl of cloud patterns over the Pacific Ocean, the brown mass of continents, the deep blue of oceans. The planet hung there like a marble, beautiful and fragile, and seeing it filled Travis with a homesickness so profound it was physical pain. He wanted to go home, to return to that blue sphere, to feel solid ground and breathe familiar air. The human-like beings positioned him in front of a console or control panel that ran along the opposite wall from the view of space. The surface was smooth and dark, with areas that glowed softly when the beings touched them. Symbols or patterns appeared under their fingers, nothing Travis recognized as numbers or letters, but configurations of light that shifted and changed. He watched, uncomprehending, as they manipulated these controls with practiced ease. The view of Earth shifted slightly, rotating as if their perspective were changing. One of the beings seemed to be trying to show him something, directing his attention to specific patterns on the console, then to the view of space, then back again. Travis had no idea what they wanted him to understand. His mind felt sluggish and fragmented, unable to process the impossible situation he found himself in. He tried to focus, tried to remember details that might help him make sense of this later, but his thoughts kept sliding away like water through cupped hand. Then they were moving again, leading him from the planetarium room back into corridors he did not recognize. Or perhaps he had been through them before and simply could not remember. Time had become elastic and unreliable. He had no sense of how long he had been in this place. Minutes, hours? The journey back to the examination room, which he now recognized with fresh dread, seemed both instantaneous and endless. The gray beings were there, waiting. Or perhaps they were different gray beings. Travis could see no way to distinguish one from another. They approached him again, and this time he had no strength left to resist. The human-like figures in their silver suits held his arms, while the gray ones moved closer with their instruments. Travis remembered tubes, though he could not clearly recall where they were placed or what they connected to. He remembered a mask or helmet being lowered over his face, something that covered his nose and mouth and made breathing feel artificial and controlled. He remembered needles or probes, sharp pains in his arm, his chest, his neck. He remembered the sensation of being turned over on the table and pressure against his back. He remembered the cold, methodical efficiency of the examination, the complete absence of anything resembling compassion or cruelty. These beings were neither sadistic nor kind. They simply performed their procedures with the detached focus of scientists working on an interesting specimen. And then his memories became fragments, isolated images without clear connection. The enormous black eyes filling his vision. A bright light that seemed to penetrate through his closed eyelids. A sensation of floating or falling. The smell of pine trees and earth, familiar and impossibly precious. Cold air on his skin. The hardness of asphalt under his body. Lights in the distance that were yellow and warm, streetlights or headlights, gloriously normal and earthly. When Travis Walton fully regained consciousness, he was lying on a road outside the small town of Heber, Arizona. He was exactly 5.6 miles from where he had disappeared 5 days earlier. The date was November 10th, 1975. 5 days of his life had simply vanished, swallowed into an experience that seemed impossible even as he lived through it. The physical evidence of his ordeal was subtle but undeniable. When he was examined by doctors in the hours and days following his return, they documented several anomalies. He had lost approximately 10 pounds, a significant amount for a man of his lean build, with no clear explanation for such rapid weight loss. There were small puncture marks on his skin, particularly on his inner arm and near his collarbone, consistent with injections or the insertion of instruments. These marks were fresh, clearly made during his missing days, but they showed signs of accelerated healing that the examining physicians found difficult to explain. The psychological trauma was even more evident. Travis exhibited signs of acute stress that could not be faked. His hands shook uncontrollably when he tried to recount his experience. He suffered from nightmares that left him screaming and drenched in sweat. He developed an aversion to certain kinds of light, particularly the blue-white fluorescent lights common in hospitals and office buildings. The sight of them would trigger panic attacks that left him gasping and disoriented. What had happened to Travis Walton during those 5 missing days? The question haunted everyone who encountered his story, but it haunted Travis himself most of all. He carried the memories, fragmentary and terrible, of a place that should not exist and beings that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. The phone rang at the Walton family home on the evening of November 10, 1975, 5 days after Travis Walton vanished into the woods. His mother, Mary Walton, lifted the receiver with trembling hands, expecting perhaps another journalist, another skeptic, another person calling to tell her that her son was either dead or a liar. Instead, she heard a voice she had prayed to hear again. Travis, daughter. But he wasn't making sense. His words tumbled out in a confused rush. He was at a gas station. He didn't know where exactly. He was hurt. He was scared. The call lasted less than a minute before the line went dead, but it was enough. Her son was alive. The gas station was a Heber truck stop, about 30 miles from where Travis had disappeared. When his brother-in-law, Grant Neff, and brother Duane arrived, they found Travis huddled in a phone booth, his face pressed against the glass. He looked like a man who had seen something no human mind was meant to process. His eyes were wide, unfocused, scanning the parking lot as though he expected something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. When they opened the door, he flinched violently, backing into the corner of the booth with his hands raised in front of his face. It took several long moments for him to recognize them, for the terror to drain from his expression enough that he could stumble forward into their arms. The drive back to Snowflake was tense and strange. Travis spoke in fragments, his thoughts scattered like broken glass. He kept asking what day it was, and when they told him it was Monday night, he insisted they were wrong. He believed he had only been gone for a few hours, maybe less. The idea that 5 days had passed seemed to strike him as absurd, impossible. He touched his face repeatedly, as if checking to make sure he was real, that his body was actually there. His hands were shaking. He complained of pain in his chest and abdomen, a deep ache that seemed to pulse through him in waves. But most disturbing was the confusion in his eyes, the sense that he was trying to reconcile 2 entirely different realities that could not both be true. By the time they reached Snowflake, news of Travis's return was already spreading. The town that had spent 5 days in limbo, torn between hope and suspicion, now faced a new kind of uncertainty. He was back, but in what condition? What had happened to him out there in the darkness, beyond the forest? The questions multiplied faster than anyone could answer them. The medical examination began almost immediately. Dr. Howard Candle, a physician in Snowflake, was the first to see Travis. What he found was puzzling. Travis was dehydrated, yes, but not severely. He showed signs of physical stress, elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, but nothing that suggested he had spent 5 days wandering through wilderness terrain trying to survive. His clothes were the same ones he had worn on the night of November 5th. They were dirty but not torn or significantly damaged. There were no scratches consistent with fighting through dense brush, no frostbite, despite freezing nighttime temperatures in the forest, no insect bites, no blisters on his feet from days of walking. His weight loss was minimal, perhaps a pound or two, nowhere near what would be expected from someone who had gone without food and water for that long. Most tellingly, there was a small puncture mark in the crook of his arm, a red dot that looked almost like an injection site. Travis had no explanation for it. He didn't remember being injured there. He didn't remember much of anything clearly. His memories of the missing time were fragmented, dreamlike, slipping away from him even as he tried to grasp them. He recalled brilliant light, a sterile room with curved walls, figures moving around him, but the details dissolved when he reached for them, leaving only fear and confusion in their wake. The local doctors recommended a more thorough examination, and Travis was taken to a hospital in Phoenix. There, additional tests were run. Blood work, X-rays, neurological assessments. Again, the results were contradictory. He showed no signs of exposure, no indication that his body had endured the hardships of wilderness survival. Yet the psychological markers were undeniable. He was genuinely traumatized, exhibiting symptoms consistent with severe shock. Whatever had happened to him, it had left deep marks on his psyche, even if his body told a different story. The news media descended on Snowflake like a swarm. The quiet town, population barely 4,000, suddenly found itself at the center of a national sensation. News vans lined the streets. Reporters knocked on doors at all hours, desperate for interviews, for any scrap of information they could use. The National Enquirer offered money for exclusive access. Television crews camped out near the Walton home, filming everything, turning private grief and confusion into public spectacle. Snowflake. Arizona had become ground zero for one of the most controversial UFO incidents in American history. The town fractured. Some residents rallied around Travis and the logging crew, believing their story, offering support and solidarity. These were people who had known the Waltons for years, who trusted Travis's character, who couldn't imagine he would fabricate something so elaborate and traumatic. But others were less convinced. Skeptics pointed to the polygraph test that Mike Rogers had failed during the search. They noted the convenient timing, how the crew had been behind schedule on their logging contract, how a bizarre story might provide an excuse for their delays. Accusations of hoax began to circulate, whispered at first, then spoken openly. Some accused the 7 men of staging the entire event to gain fame and profit from book deals and media appearances. The division cut through families, through friendships that had lasted decades. Arguments erupted in the local diner, at church, in the grocery store aisles. People who had lived side by side in relative harmony now viewed each other with suspicion and resentment. The shared sense of community that had defined Snowflake began to erode, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that hung in the air like smoke. For Travis and the logging crew, the personal cost was devastating. Death threats arrived in the mail, anonymous letters filled with rage and accusations. Someone spray-painted liar across the side of Mike Rogers' truck. The crew members found themselves ostracized by people they had considered friends. Work became difficult to find. Who wanted to hire the men at the center of such controversy? The stigma followed them everywhere. Even decades later, some of them would struggle with the weight of what had happened, the way a single night in the woods had irrevocably altered the trajectory of their lives. UFO researchers flooded into town, bringing their equipment, their theories, their absolute certainty that Travis Walton had been abducted by extraterrestrial beings. They conducted their own investigations, interviewed witnesses, analyzed the timeline, measured radiation levels in the forest. Some claimed to find evidence of an unusual presence in the area, strange magnetic anomalies, vegetation that showed signs of exposure to intense heat. Others found nothing conclusive, only the same ambiguous details that could be interpreted a dozen different ways depending on what someone wanted to believe. The time discrepancy haunted Travis more than almost anything else. 5 days. He had been gone for 5 entire days, Yet in his mind, only hours had passed. He remembered the light, the moment of impact or abduction, or whatever it had been. Then fragments of images, sensations, terror, and then the gas station phone booth. But where were the hours in between? The days, the meals he should have eaten, the nights he should have slept. The psychological implications were staggering. Had his memory been altered? Suppressed? Was time itself different wherever he had been? The questions spiraled endlessly, offering no solid ground to stand on. Some researchers pointed to similar reports from other alleged abductees, stories of missing time, of experiences that seemed to last moments but corresponded to hours or days in the outside world. They spoke of time dilation, of the possibility that consciousness could be manipulated, that memories could be selectively erased or modified. These explanations satisfied some, but they also raised even more disturbing questions about the nature of reality, about what it meant to trust your own mind when your own mind could be rewritten like a computer file. Travis underwent additional polygraph examinations in the following months. The results were mixed, some indicating deception, others suggesting he was telling the truth as he understood it. Polygraphs measure physiological responses to questions, but they cannot account for false memories, for trauma-induced confusion, for the way the human mind sometimes protects itself by burying experiences too terrible to consciously process. The tests provided no definitive answers, only more fuel for both believers and skeptics to claim vindication. The story of Travis Walton's return did not bring closure. Instead, it opened a chasm of uncertainty that would never fully close. The medical evidence suggested he had not spent 5 days in the wilderness, yet he was genuinely traumatized by something. The town was divided, the crew was vilified, and the truth remained maddeningly out of reach. In the end, Snowflake was left with a mystery that would define it for generations, a wound that never quite healed, and the uncomfortable knowledge that some questions might not have answers that human beings can comprehend. The forests of Arizona hold many secrets, but few files in government archives carry the weight of what began on November 5, 1975. While the world focused on Travis Walton's missing days, a parallel story was unfolding in offices from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to the dusty filing cabinets of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. What the public didn't know, what wouldn't surface for decades, was that Travis Walton had stumbled into something far larger than a single incident in the woods. Project Blue Book had officially closed its doors in 1970, the Air Force declaring that UFO investigations no longer warranted official attention. The publicly stated reason was that 18 years of investigation had found no threat to national security and no evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. But the closing of Blue Book didn't mean the Air Force stopped paying attention. It meant they stopped talking about it. When the Walton case exploded across headlines, certain files began circulating again through channels that technically no longer existed. Documents released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests paint a different picture than the official dismissal. Air Force intelligence maintained what they called a passive monitoring system, a network of contacts in civilian UFO organizations who would flag cases of particular interest. The Walton incident lit up this network immediately. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence in the form of the failed polygraph attempts and later successful ones, and most importantly, a pattern that matched classified reports from other cases that had never made it into Blue Book's public records. The Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, known as APRO, had been investigating UFO reports since 1952. By the mid-70s, they'd accumulated thousands of case files, and what directors Jim and Coral Lawrence had discovered troubled them deeply. There were patterns emerging, similarities across cases separated by years and thousands of miles, reported by people who had no contact with each other and no access to details from other incidents. The Walton case fit these patterns with disturbing precision. To understand why the Walton incident sent shockwaves through both official and civilian investigation networks, you need to look back to September 19, 1961. That's when Betty and Barney Hill were driving through the White Mountains of New Hampshire, heading home to Portsmouth after a vacation. What happened on that drive wouldn't fully emerge until years later, through sessions with Boston psychiatrist Benjamin Simon. Under hypnosis, separated and questioned independently, the Hills described remarkably similar experiences. A craft with windows, beings with large heads and dark wraparound eyes. A medical examination aboard the craft. Missing time that couldn't be accounted for. The Hill case became the template, though nobody called it that at the time. It was investigated quietly, discussed in hushed conversations among researchers, and eventually became public in a way that changed how abduction experiences would be reported and understood. The beings the Hills described, particularly their eyes, would become a recurring element in case after case. Large, dark, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to see through you, that communicated without words, that projected a mixture of clinical detachment and inexplicable purpose. Fast forward to October 11, 1973. Pascagoula, Mississippi. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing on the west bank of the Pascagoula River when they heard a strange whirring sound. What they reported next would add another data point to the emerging pattern. A craft appeared, hovering just above the ground. Beings emerged, but these weren't the small gray entities from the Hill case. These were different, robotic almost, with claw-like hands and wrinkled gray skin. But the experience itself, the paralysis, the medical examination, the missing time, these elements matched. The terror was identical. What made the Pascagoula case particularly credible to investigators was what happened after. The men reported their experience to authorities immediately, clearly traumatized. When Sheriff Fred Diamond placed them alone in a room they assumed was empty, a hidden tape recorder captured their private conversation. There was no discussion of a hoax, no laughter or planning. Just two frightened men trying to process something they couldn't explain, with Calvin Parker audibly distressed and Hickson trying to calm him down. That tape convinced many skeptics that whatever these men experienced, they genuinely believed it had happened. By the time Travis Walton vanished in 1975, APRO's files contained hundreds of similar reports. The Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, was building parallel databases. Researchers began using computers to analyze the cases, looking for commonalities. What emerged was unsettling. Despite the reports coming from different countries, different decades, different types of witnesses, certain elements repeated with statistical improbability. The descriptions of the beings were remarkably consistent. The medical examinations focused on similar areas. The aftermath, the psychological impact, followed predictable patterns. And the missing time, that gap in memory that witnesses struggled to account for, appeared in case after case. The beings described by Travis Walton during his conscious memories aboard the craft matched descriptions from earlier cases with eerie precision. Large heads, disproportionate to their bodies. Those eyes, dark and enormous, that seemed to convey intelligence and something else. Something that didn't translate into human emotional categories. Thin bodies, pale or gray skin, minimal clothing. And their movements, described by witness after witness as smooth, almost floating, economical, and purposeful. Travis's description of the taller, more human-looking beings he encountered later added another layer that also appeared in other cases, suggesting a hierarchy or different types of entities involved in these incidents. But here's what set the Walton case apart in the minds of investigators. Most abduction reports came from single witnesses or couples, people whose experiences could be dismissed, fairly or not, as hallucinations, dreams, or fabrications. Travis Walton had 6 other men who saw the craft. 6 men who saw him struck by the beam of light. 6 men who passed polygraph examinations about what they witnessed. 6 men whose lives were upended by their decision to report what they saw. That kind of corroboration was almost unprecedented. The financial motivation argument fell apart under scrutiny. The logging crew lost work, faced ridicule, dealt with suspicions of murder. Travis himself disappeared from public view for years after the initial media attention. There was no book deal waiting, no movie rights negotiated in advance. The money came later, much later, and by then the damage to their reputations and relationships was done. If this was a hoax, it was the most counterproductive hoax imaginable. Then there's the consistency over time. Hoaxes fall apart. Details change. Stories evolve. People crack under pressure or guilt. The Walton case has been examined for nearly 5 decades now. The crew members have been interviewed hundreds of times. Their accounts remain consistent in the core details. The peripheral elements might vary slightly, the way any genuine memory shifts around the edges with time and retelling, but the central facts stay locked in place. That kind of consistency is difficult to maintain if you're fabricating a story, especially across multiple witnesses over multiple decades. What truly captured the attention of government monitors and civilian investigators alike was the location. The area around Turkey Springs, Arizona, wasn't just the site of a single incident. Local reports documented unusual aerial phenomena in that region going back years before Travis's experience. Ranchers reported lights moving in ways that defied conventional aircraft capabilities. Hikers described encounters with objects that hovered silently above the tree line. After Travis's incident, the reports continued. The area developed a reputation, whispered about in the communities nearby, marked on maps passed between UFO researchers. This pattern of repeated activity in specific locations appeared in classified Air Force files that Blue Book had never made public. Certain areas seemed to attract repeated incidents, becoming what researchers would later call windows or hotspots. The Uinta Basin in Utah, the San Luis Valley in Colorado, the area around Stephenville, Texas, and the forests around Turkey Springs, Arizona. The Air Force tracked these locations, noted the patterns, and drew conclusions they chose not to share with the public. The files that eventually trickled out through declassification revealed something else. The official dismissive stance toward UFO reports masked a more complex reality. Internal memos showed serious concern about cases involving multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and radar confirmation. The Walton case checked multiple boxes on their criteria for cases requiring deeper analysis. The fact that it happened in an area with a history of sightings elevated its significance even further. APRO's investigation files on the Walton case fill boxes. They interviewed not just the crew but families, friends, local law enforcement, Forest Service employees, and other witnesses who came forward after hearing about the incident. They conducted their own polygraph examinations. They brought in medical experts to evaluate Travis's condition after his return. They mapped the site, documented the physical environment, looked for radiation signatures or unusual magnetic readings. The thoroughness of their investigation put many official inquiries to shame. What troubled APRO's investigators most wasn't just what Travis reported experiencing. It was how perfectly his account fit the template established by earlier cases they'd documented. The initial confusion and terror. The medical examination with its invasive procedures and strange instruments. The sense of being studied, of being an object of scientific curiosity to intelligences that operated by rules he couldn't comprehend. And then the release, the dumping back into his own world with gaps in memory and trauma that would take years to process. The Hill case, Pascagoula, and Walton formed a triangle of highly credible abduction reports that researchers used as reference points. Each brought something different to the table. The Hills brought medical professional credibility and psychiatric documentation. Pascagoula brought the sheriff's hidden tape and immediate law enforcement involvement. Walton brought multiple witnesses and extended missing time with conscious memories. Together, they created a framework that hundreds of later cases would echo. MUFON's databases, growing through the 70s and 80s, showed geographic clusters and temporal patterns. Certain years saw spikes in abduction reports. Certain regions produced more cases than statistical distribution would predict. And the details within the reports, when stripped of individual variations, revealed a core narrative that repeated with troubling consistency. Beings with large eyes and thin bodies. Medical examinations focusing on reproductive systems. Psychological impacts including nightmares, anxiety, and a sense of being monitored or tracked. And often, a return to the same witnesses over years, suggesting ongoing interest rather than single encounters. The government's interest in these patterns never really ceased, despite the official closure of Blue Book. It simply went deeper underground, became more compartmentalized, operated through contractors and academic proxies rather than official military channel. The Walton case appears in files that weren't supposed to exist, analyzed by programs that had no official names, discussed in meetings that generated no public minutes. What makes the classified context around the Walton case particularly significant is what it reveals about the gap between public statements and private concerns. Publicly, The government maintained that UFOs posed no threat and warranted no serious scientific study. Privately, certain offices continued to track cases, analyze patterns, and try to understand what was happening in the skies and forests of America. The Walton incident forced uncomfortable questions that had no easy answers. If this was real, if those 7 men genuinely encountered something non-human in those woods, then the official narrative was worse than incomplete. It was a deliberate obscuring of a truth that had profound implications for humanity's place in the cosmos. The abduction phenomenon of the 70s represented something that neither government nor science knew how to address. It was too strange for conventional frameworks, too consistent to dismiss entirely, and too troubling to acknowledge openly. So it existed in this liminal space, investigated quietly by civilian organizations, monitored discreetly by official channels, and discussed publicly only in ways that invited ridicule. The Walton case, with its multiple witnesses and dramatic circumstances, threatened to pull these uncomfortable realities into mainstream awareness. That it largely failed to do so says as much about human psychology and institutional inertia as it does about the nature of the phenomenon itself. The smell hit him first when consciousness returned, and 48 years later, Travis Walton still struggles to describe it accurately. It wasn't chemical, wasn't organic, wasn't anything that belonged in the catalog of human experience. Sterile, he says, but wrong. Clean in a way that made his skin crawl, as if the air itself had been stripped of something essential, leaving behind an atmosphere that his lungs recognized as fundamentally alien. He became aware of his body before he could move it. Complete paralysis, but not the peaceful numbness of anesthesia. Every nerve ending screamed with sensation, while his muscles refused commands. His eyes were open, or perhaps they had never closed. The distinction seemed meaningless in that room where light came from everywhere and nowhere, where shadows bent in directions that violated the basic geometry of reality. 3 beings stood around him. Stood isn't quite right. They occupied space near him, their movements fluid in ways that human joints don't allow. Short, Travis describes them, maybe 4.5 feet tall, but that mundane detail dissolves when he tries to explain what looking at them felt like. Their skin held a quality he still can't name. Not gray, not white, but something in between, with a texture that suggested it had never been touched by sunlight or wind or any of the elements that weather living things. Their eyes dominated their oversized heads. Black, completely black, no whites, no iris variation. Just perfect obsidian spheres that reflected his own terrified face back at him. But calling them eyes suggests they functioned like human eyes, and Travis knows now that whatever he was looking into served purposes beyond mere sight. Those dark pools seemed to pull information from him, extracting data through vision alone. The examination table beneath him felt wrong, too. Not cold metal, not padded, but something that seemed to adjust to his body temperature instantly, matching it so perfectly that he couldn't distinguish where his skin ended and the surface began. This detail haunts him in ways the more dramatic elements don't. The casual sophistication of a material that could do such a thing, the implication of technology so advanced that even their furniture operated on principles we haven't discovered. One of the beings moved closer. Their locomotion defied natural law. No head bob, no weight shift from foot to foot, no compensatory balance adjustments. They simply translated through space with mechanical smoothness. An arm extended toward him, 3 fingers and a thumb, longer than human proportions, moving with insect-like precision. When those fingers touched his forehead, Travis felt the touch reverberate through his entire nervous system, as if his body had become a tuning fork struck at just the right frequency. The communication came then. Not words, not images exactly, but pure meaning deposited directly into his consciousness. Cold meaning, empty of emotion or context, or any of the warmth that accompanies human thought. Instructions appeared in his mind fully formed. Don't move. Don't resist. This will continue. The messages carried no malice but no comfort either. Just the flat statement of facts from an intelligence that registered his terror with the same indifference a scientist might note the trembling of a laboratory mouse. Travis says the hardest part to explain is the quality of their attention. They looked at him, moved around him, touched him with instruments he couldn't properly see, but he never felt seen as a person. Specimen. Subject. Dot. Data point. Dot. I. He could sense their focus, intense and unwavering, but it was the focus of curiosity directed at an object, not a conscious being. In that room, under those hands, Travis stopped being human in any way that mattered. He became a thing to be cataloged, measured, understood in purely mechanical terms. The beings never spoke to each other, at least not in any way he could detect. Yet they moved with coordinated purpose, each one performing tasks that complemented the others. Their coordination suggested communication, happening on frequencies or through methods completely invisible to him. Sometimes one would pause, and another would immediately continue an action, as if they shared a single distributed consciousness, operating multiple bodies. Pain came in waves. Not the sharp pain of injury, but something deeper and more disturbing. The sensation of being opened without cutting, examined from the inside out, his cellular structure somehow made transparent to their instruments. Travis describes feeling his own body become foreign to him, as if he was simultaneously himself and a thing he was observing from outside. The existential horror of that disconnect, of consciousness persisting while the boundaries of self dissolved, left psychological scars that never properly healed. His eyes tracked what movement they could, paralyzed as he was. He noticed details that made no architectural sense. Walls that curved in ways that hurt to look at. Corners that seemed to have too many or too few angles. Lighting that cast no shadows or cast shadows in impossible directions. The room itself seemed to reject the basic rules that govern physical space, as if it existed partially in dimensions his visual cortex couldn't properly process. One being brought something close to his face. A device, though calling it a device implies engineering on human terms. It looked grown rather than built, organic curves with mechanical precision, surfaces that shifted properties as he watched. They positioned it above his right eye, and Travis felt a pulling sensation deep in his optic nerve, a feeling of information being extracted, copied, removed. The violation was absolute. They weren't hurting him, not in any way designed to cause suffering, but neither were they concerned with his experience beyond how it affected their data collection. Time became meaningless. Minutes felt like hours, or perhaps hours compressed into minutes. His consciousness kept trying to slip away, seeking the mercy of unconsciousness, but something kept holding him back. They wanted him aware, he realized. Whatever they were doing required his consciousness to be present, his nervous system active and responsive. The cruelty wasn't intentional, which somehow made it worse. They needed him awake the way a surgeon needs a patient conscious for certain procedures. His suffering was a necessary parameter, nothing more. The beings eventually moved back. Their attention shifted to something he couldn't see, some data or reading or measurement that drew their focus away from his body. In that moment of reduced scrutiny, Travis felt almost nostalgic for human cruelty. A human torturer acknowledges their victim's humanity even in the act of destroying it. These beings had never acknowledged him as anything beyond sophisticated biological machinery, and somehow that absolute negation of his personhood cut deeper than any physical violation could have. Then came a moment that still sends ice through his veins. One of the beings turned those black eyes directly toward his, and Travis felt something probe the edges of his consciousness with such casual invasiveness that he understood a terrible truth. They weren't just studying his body. They were mapping his mind, cataloging his thoughts, treating his consciousness itself as just another system to document and understand. In that crystalline moment of contact, Travis glimpsed something that shattered his understanding of humanity's place in the universe. We are not partners in creation. We are not even acknowledged as peers. To these beings, we are complex animals, interesting perhaps, but not fundamentally different from any other species they might study. The nightmares started the moment he returned. 48 years later, they haven't stopped. Travis wakes gasping, not from dreams of being taken, but from dreams where he's still there, where he never left, where the return was just another phase of the experiment. He dreams of being studied by beings whose thoughts touch his mind like cold fingers, extracting memories while implanting doubts. Did he really come back? Or is consciousness itself something they've learned to manipulate, making him believe he escaped while his body remains on that table. His mind fed comfortable illusions to keep it calm and measurable. His therapists use the language of post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, emotional dysregulation. But Travis knows these clinical terms can't capture the specific horror of his experience. PTSD implies trauma from human violence, from war or assault or disaster, events that, however terrible, occur within the framework of human experience. What happened to him took place outside that framework entirely. He was traumatized by contact with intelligence that fundamentally doesn't recognize trauma as a concept, that can't be appealed to or reasoned with, or even properly communicated with in any reciprocal sense. The detail that haunts him most, the one he avoided discussing for decades, is the sense of routine. Everything about that room, those beings, their procedures suggested practiced efficiency. They had done this before, many times before, would do it again. He wasn't special, wasn't chosen for any meaningful reason. He was simply available, in the wrong place at the wrong time, selected by whatever criteria they used to choose specimens from an endlessly renewable supply of human subjects. And then they let him go. That's what disturbs him most now, looking back with 48 years of perspective. They simply stopped, moved him somewhere else, and discarded him back into his own world like a lab rat returned to its cage. No explanation, no closure, no indication they considered him worthy of such courtesies. Travis believes now, based on nothing but instinct honed by that experience, that his return was accidental. Perhaps a miscalculation, perhaps a change in parameters, perhaps simple apathy about what happened to him after they finished collecting their data. He sees them sometimes in crowds. Not the beings themselves, but the look. People whose eyes have gone somewhere else, who move through the world with a subtle wrongness in their gait, their reactions, their engagement with reality. Travis wonders how many others are out there, carrying memories they can't fully access, marked by encounters they barely survived. The phenomenon didn't start with him and hasn't ended. Whatever process selected him continues, quiet and methodical, harvesting data from members of a species that still believes itself to be alone in the universe. Late at night, when the nightmares wake him and sleep won't return, Travis confronts the possibility that terrifies him more than anything that happened on that craft. What if the beings weren't aliens from another planet, but scientists from another time? What if he glimpsed not visitors from elsewhere, but researchers from our own future, studying their primitive ancestors with the same detached interest we might show examining Neolithic remains? The thought suggests a future where humanity survives but transforms into something that views its own past with such clinical detachment that individual suffering becomes merely interesting data. He carries the weight of absolute knowledge that cannot be shared. Travis knows with certainty that we are not the measure of consciousness in this universe, that intelligence exists which regards us the way we regard insects, with curiosity perhaps, but never with fellowship. And he knows that somewhere, in rooms that violate the geometry of normal space, the examination continues. Other people are becoming specimens. Other minds are being mapped and cataloged by beings who will never answer questions or provide comfort or acknowledge that such things might even be desired. The most disturbing detail isn't what happened during those missing 5 days. It's what continues to happen every day since. Travis walks through a world where people believe themselves safe, believe themselves important, believe that human experience represents the center of meaning in the cosmos. He knows better. He knows we are specimens in an experiment we don't understand, conducted by intelligence we can't comprehend, for purposes that don't include our well-being or even our awareness. And that knowledge, that absolute certain knowledge, is a burden heavier than any physical trauma could ever be. Nearly 5 decades have passed since Travis Walton stumbled out of that Arizona forest, forever changed by what happened during those 5 missing days. Yet the questions that emerged from his ordeal have only deepened with time, spreading like roots through soil, reaching into territories of human understanding we still cannot map. The mystery of that November night in 1975 has never truly been solved. Instead, it has multiplied, fragmenting into dozens of smaller mysteries that haunt researchers, skeptics, and believers alike. Why was Travis returned at all? This question sits at the very heart of the enigma. Those who study abduction phenomena recognize an uncomfortable pattern in the testimonies that have emerged over decades. Some people report being held for weeks. Others describe recursive abductions, being taken again and again throughout their lives, marked by scars they cannot explain and memories that surface in dreams. Still others simply vanish, their cases filed away as missing persons, their families left to wonder forever. But Travis came back after 5 days, deposited on that highway like a package delivered to the wrong address. The beings who took him went to extraordinary lengths to abduct him from among witnesses, to keep him for those crucial days, and then they simply let him go. They returned him to almost the exact location where they had taken him, as if completing some circuit, fulfilling some obligation we cannot comprehend. What made Travis different? What made him worthy of return when others have not been granted that mercy? The examination he endured raises equally troubling questions about purpose and intent. Travis describes being subjected to procedures that seemed medical in nature, yet alien in execution. The beings pressed a clear mask over his face. They restrained him on a table beneath a dome of light. But to what end? If these entities possess technology capable of traversing the cosmos, of manipulating human consciousness, and overriding our physical will, what could they possibly learn from examining one terrified logger from Arizona? The disparity between their apparent technological superiority and the crude, almost primitive nature of the examination suggests purposes we may not have the framework to understand. Were they studying his biology, or was something else being measured? His fear response, perhaps? His psychological resilience? The very nature of human consciousness under extreme duress? Some researchers suggest that abduction experiences may serve purposes entirely unrelated to scientific study as we understand it. Perhaps these encounters are rituals, demonstrations, or even warnings. Then there is that moment that Travis describes with consistent horror across decades of retelling. The moment he woke on that table, when the beings seemed genuinely surprised. Their reaction suggested something had gone wrong, that he was not supposed to regain consciousness when he did. The paralysis that had held him was supposed to last longer. This single detail opens a window into something deeply unsettling. It implies that the abduction was planned, choreographed, that there were expectations and protocols, and Travis disrupted them simply by waking up. What would have happened if he had remained paralyzed as intended? What procedures or processes did his unexpected awareness interrupt? The beings retreated when he became conscious, almost as if his awareness itself was problematic, as if being observed by a conscious subject violated some rule or principle they were operating under. Even within those 5 missing days, there are hours Travis cannot account for. He remembers the initial beam of light. He remembers fragmentary images from the ship. He recalls the room with the star map, the corridor, the examination table. But when researchers and hypnotherapists have attempted to map his memories against the timeline, gaps emerge. Significant gaps. Hours where his memory simply goes dark, like redacted sections in a classified document. These missing hours within the missing days suggest that what Travis consciously remembers may only be a fraction of what actually occurred. Memory suppression among abduction experiencers is well documented, though poorly understood. Some recall events decades later, triggered by seemingly random stimuli. Others recover memories under hypnosis, though the reliability of such recollections remains hotly debated. The troubling implication is that Travis may have endured experiences so disturbing, so incompatible with normal human experience, that his mind simply sealed them away. Or worse, that they were deliberately erased, edited from his consciousness by whatever intelligence orchestrated his abduction. The forest where Travis was taken has never stopped being active. This fact alone transforms his case from an isolated incident into something far more persistent and disturbing. In the decades since 1975, the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest has generated dozens of UFO reports. Witnesses describe lights moving through the canopy in ways that defy conventional explanation. Hunters report finding their vehicles drained of electrical power in remote clearings. Hikers describe missing time, finding themselves miles from where they last remember being, with hours unaccounted for. Local residents speak of certain areas they avoid after dark, places where the air feels different, where electronics malfunction and animals refuse to enter. Some researchers have attempted to map these reports, finding curious concentrations of activity in specific zones. The area near Turkey Springs where Travis disappeared appears again and again in these accounts. Whatever happened that November night may not have been an isolated event, but rather one visible incident in an ongoing phenomenon that continues largely unobserved. Travis himself has said, repeatedly and with genuine emotion, that he would not wish his experience on anyone. This statement carries profound weight. Here is a man who has spent decades as a figure of fascination, who has been interviewed countless times, who has been the subject of books and films. Yet he gains no joy from his notoriety. The experience left him with trauma that therapy and time have never fully healed. He describes nightmares that persist decades later. He talks about the profound violation of being taken, of having his will completely overridden, of being utterly powerless in the hands of beings whose motives he cannot fathom. When he says he would not wish this on anyone, he speaks from a place of genuine suffering, from knowledge of what it means to be transformed by an encounter that defies integration into normal life. The chilling reality is that reports like Travis's continue worldwide with disturbing regularity. Every year, new cases emerge. People from disparate cultures, different continents, with no connection to one another, describe experiences that share uncanny similarities. The paralysis, the lights, the beings with large eyes, the examinations, the missing time. The details vary, but the core elements remain consistent enough to suggest either a genuine phenomenon or a collective mythology so deeply embedded in human consciousness that it manifests independently across populations. Either possibility is profoundly unsettling. We are no closer to understanding what takes people. Despite decades of research, despite thousands of reported cases, despite advances in technology and investigative methodology, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Are these encounters physical or psychological? Are they experiences happening in our reality or in some adjacent dimension of consciousness? Are the beings involved extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something else entirely? We do not know. We have theories, hypotheses, competing frameworks of interpretation, but no definitive answers. And perhaps most disturbing of all, we cannot explain why some come back changed forever. Travis returned, but he was not the same man who was taken. The experience rewired something fundamental in him, altered his relationship with reality itself. He knows with absolute certainty that we are not alone, that human understanding of the universe is fragmentary at best, and that we are subject to forces and intelligences that operate beyond our comprehension or control. This knowledge is not empowering. It is isolating. It sets abduction experiencers apart, marks them as people who have seen beyond the veil and found not wonder but terror. The Travis Walton case remains unsolved, not because we lack information, but because the information we have leads only to deeper mysteries. Each answer spawns new questions. Each explanation reveals new impossibilities. And somewhere in the Arizona forests, under the same stars that witnessed his disappearance, the phenomenon continues, indifferent to our need for understanding, unconcerned with our demand for answers. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more, right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.